My name is Theresa Culley. I am the editor-in-chief of Applications in Plant Sciences. This is one of the publications of the Botanical Society of America. And so we're pleased to be able to offer you this first webinar discussion. And so we thought this would be really helpful for those of you and us who are learning how to write your story well. And so before we get started, I just want to go over a few basic things, just so we're all on the same page. First of all, everyone should have been muted when you entered. Your microphones should have been muted. If they haven't, or if you've unmuted, if you can mute it as we're going along, that'd be much appreciated, just so we don't have any background noise. And of course, if you want to ask a question, definitely unmute yourself. If you find yourself having bandwidth issues or connectivity issues, you might want to go ahead and try to turn off your camera, but you're more than welcome to leave it on if it works for you. I would encourage you to use the chat for questions as we go along, and we have various people who will be monitoring it, and I'll be looking at that as well. And you could use that for questions for myself as we talk, and also for any of our panelists as we go along. So that's another important thing. The other item of note is that this session is being recorded, so I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that. And we will be posting this later in some forum, so other people can download this and look at it as well. So this is a offering from the Botanical Society of America, of course, and something that we're very, very proud to do. And so we're just going to go ahead and launch right into it. The format is going to be as follows. I have a series of different slides. We're going to be touching on different topics. Some of these, it might be familiar to you in terms of how to write well. Some hopefully will be new ideas and tips that you haven't heard about before. And then at various times, we have a panel of experts, and I'll introduce them next, but we're going to be tossing the question out to them. And then there'll be opportunity for any of those who are attending to be able to ask your question of myself or of the panelists as well. And again, you can ask those questions through the chat, or if you want to raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask the question directly at the appropriate time, that would be wonderful. So the purpose of this is, again, as it was advertised, it's a webinar, but we also want it to be a discussion. So hopefully I'm going to keep things timed enough so we have hopefully about 10 minutes or more at the end where people could just ask any questions of really anyone if you want to learn how to write well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. And for this, I'm actually going to ask them to each go ahead and introduce themselves if they can. And so, and we can go in order here. And is Dr. Michael Barker is our first panelist.
Hello, good morning.
Hey, Mike, can you tell us maybe a little bit about yourself, how many years you've been writing, and then also maybe the best tip you've ever received about writing?
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. I think I submitted my first paper like in 2000 or 2001, so about 20 years now. And, I think the best tip that I ever sort of got when thinking about writing a manuscript, I think there's a lot of advice, and we'll probably get into a lot of these sorts of things today, but for me, the best tip is that try not to be too hard on yourself for not getting enough done. How's that? I think that some days the words flow and other days they don't. Just step back and do something else. I feel like we've all got so many other things happening, and switch gears and come back to it. And I feel like that was a good tip, because I used to sort of try to, as an undergrad, when I started writing, just tried to sit there and I remember just staying up really late, trying to write and just making no progress. So that's I feel like that was a good tip. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Roxio, I have you as next.
Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. And yes, I'm Rocio de Ana from Argentina, actually. So I'm an international. So, well, I'm a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Colorado at Boulder. But right now I'm working at the Natural History Museum with that grant. And also I'm planning a position in Argentina at the Multidisciplinary Institute of Plant Biology in Cordoba, Argentina. So I'm a more recent writer actually, because I think that my first paper I submitted by 2013, so not so long before. And I think that the best tip I can say is just don't push too hard to have each paragraph that you are writing to be perfect at the first time that you are writing. You just need to take time and just write what you have in your head, like what you are thinking, and answering the question that you want to show in your manuscript. But don't push too hard to have all the scientific words there or all the information, or to be perfect at once, I mean. So I think that's to start, and to not just have some blocks when you are trying to advance over your manuscript.
Yeah, good advice. Great, thank you. And now we have next is Marcello.
Hi, hello everyone. So yeah, I am originally from Brazil, but I work in Mexico at the National Autonomous University. And I think I fall more or less in the middle of Michael and Rocio, because my first paper I published in 2009. So, and it was obviously the hardest one because it gets easier along the way. So that's one of the important things that we have to keep in mind. It's never easy, of course, because it's always the blank paper in front of you. But what helps me a lot is, first I try always to brainstorm everything that I want to be in the paper. So I put all the keywords, and it's also how I work with my students. And then we try to make an outline of this. So given this information, how we can put the blocks together. And it helps me having like a complete idea of the article before I start writing it. Of course, in the process, you change sometimes. You realize that one part is more important than the other. And then even though I revisit this outline and try to modify in there, and that makes me more or less keep cohesive and have the whole idea of what I want to talk, not to get like completely lost. And also to avoid when you start repeating yourself, because that's one of the common things when we are writing in science. Then we come together, and as an editor, I encounter a lot of papers in which the person is saying too many times the same thing. So to keep it more cohesive and short, it's really important, because I think everyone is overwhelmed with the amount of things that we have to read.
I agree. So I think we could stop the talk now. You guys just gave all the advice. Just kidding. You gave a lot of the things I have, but that's great. So let's go ahead. Great. Thank you so much. And like I mentioned, we'll be coming back. And also any of our panelists as we go along, if you feel inspired and want to add in something, feel free to go ahead and do that. I have asked in the chat, we're going to have a few of our BSA staff monitoring those. Pam Diggle, who's the editor-in-chief of American Journal of Botany, our sister publication, is also here as well. And I've asked her to also monitor in the chat and answer any questions that might arise. Just before I forget, we'll have this at the end, a reminder that our second webinar will be next week, and Pam Diggle will be responsible for that. So let's go ahead and get started. How I organize this, and pushing the right buttons, is on several different topics. First, I thought it would be helpful, just the basics, like who should be an author, right? And that seems pretty easy, but it actually can get pretty complicated, especially when you have more than one author involved. And so both the American Journal of Botany and Applications in Plant Sciences state on their instructions for authors guidance on who should be an author. And this is what it is. Essentially, and it makes sense if you think about it. A person is an author if they have made a substantial contribution to the project, right? The conception, the design, getting the data, analyzing it, so forth. Really, they need to be involved in working on the manuscript, drafting it, revising it, rewriting it, that type of thing. Authors also have to give final approval of the version to be published. And in many journals, including ours, there's a page where someone has to indicate, either the actual authors or the primary author has to indicate on behalf of the other authors that they're all aware that this paper is being submitted. And so the point there is that each author is actually taking responsibility for this paper and for the content of the paper. And so again, that's sort of echoed in number 4 here, that each author needs to be accountable for all aspects of the work. I like to think of it as an author needs to be able to explain basically what the study was about. They might not be an expert on one element of the study, but they can generally talk about why it was important, what it found, and so forth. So if it's a situation where you can't really say, yes to some of those, if the answer is no, then that person should really be in the acknowledgement section. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, many journals also do require a author contribution statement, and ours do as well. And this is just one I grabbed. I think this is from American Journal of Botany. I just randomly grabbed one. But essentially it outlines exactly what the authors did, their contribution, who was responsible for the writing and so forth, just what I talked about in the last slide. So again, it's important to remember that these are requirements, and more journals that I have been seeing actually have been asking for these author contributions. Now, another really interesting thing that you may not be aware of is something called credit, or CRT. This is something that is being instituted by both American Journal of Botany and Applications in Plant Sciences. What it is, it's a high-level taxonomy. Essentially what it does is it allows authors and people involved in a project to actually identify their direct contribution. So there's 14 different roles, and those roles are here. You can see if someone has been responsible for conceptualizing the study, for gathering the data, for writing, for doing, the software, if there's a software part to it. So this is really cool, because then you can actually classify the exact contribution of each of these individuals. And so here, one of the things you could do is, this is not only for the authors, but also those in the acknowledgements, which is really nice. And a given individual can have more than one role. So you can actually be pretty specific in what these individuals are doing. The other important point is, of course, this information could be displayed in the text within the author contributions of the actual article itself, but it's also captured in the metadata. And the metadata is pretty much, you can think of it as the unseen portion of a paper that is built in. It goes into the HTML and the PDF, and that's something that can be pulled out later if, for example, there's a meta-analysis that's being done on that paper. So this is a really nice way, again, for authors to indicate exactly who did what on the paper. So that's something you might want to be aware of, and you might be looking for, especially if you submit to our journals or to other journals as well. It's something I would recommend looking for. That could be really helpful. So let's talk a little bit more about authorship. And then the question is, okay, who should be an author? The most important thing I would say is that prior to submitting an article, and I would actually say prior to even, once there's a glimmer that an article might be coming from a paper, it's really important that all the people involved come to some agreement, have a discussion as to who's going to be an author, and then also ideally the order of authors on a paper. And that might change later on as you go along, but that's really important to have that conversation. I've seen cases where there was not a conversation, and then later on, there's some surprises along the way. So I think it's a good idea, just when you first get started on a study, it's looking like something's happening, it's gonna be really good, you're gonna have a paper come out of it. It's good to have that discussion about authors. And of course, the different types, there's the first author. First author typically is the person who actually did the bulk of the writing, or maybe the first draft, and maybe the others really contributed well after that. In some cases, the last author is viewed as a position of, I don't know, honor, if you want to say. This might be the person overseeing the entire project. It might be the PI. In many other types of disciplines, either the first or the last author is considered to be prestigious. Of course, the first author is going to be the one, if there's a series of authors, that's the one that's cited as, you know, Smith et al., for example, if Smith was the first author. So that's something to think about as well. And then there's also the corresponding author. The corresponding author can be any of those authors, but that's the person who's going to be participating and working with the editorial office as the paper goes through the pipeline. This is important because, you know, I've served as both like the first author. In some cases, like if I have a student who left off and became an instructor somewhere else and didn't really have time to do the paper, you know, they might remain as first author, but then I might be corresponding author to make sure that paper gets through the route. So there's different ways that you can do it. So those are the different types of authors. And of course, you can have a lot more, you know, depending on who's involved. So if you do have a lot of authors, people do this different ways. Again, this would be a discussion that you would need to have with your group. So whether it be in order of contribution, that's the way that I've typically done it. But sometimes you could see that people have it in alphabetical order. If everyone agrees, you could do it that way. And then the other thing too is you might have a situation where two people really did the bulk of the work. And you know, it's hard to say whether one or the other should be first author. And in those cases, it is possible, and you would have to check with the journal, but it is possible where you could have two first authors. Now, realistically, there's one person who's in front, right? But what you do then is you would indicate with superscripts that the first two, usually individuals, contributed equally to the work and share first authorship. So that's something that can be done. So that's important to think about. All right, next is choosing a journal. So you've maybe started to work on your paper, but you have to start thinking about, you know, what should the journal be? And some people actually write the whole paper and then think about the journal. And maybe that as a panel, we might be able to talk about that, the pros and cons. But in choosing a journal, of course, you need to make sure your topic is appropriate for whatever journal you're looking at. You need to, of course, read the journal description, the aims and scopes. So go onto the website, you know, click usually the about journal or for authors, something there, and read about it. Does your paper as you envision in your head, or maybe you've already written down, does that conform with the expectations of that journal, what they're looking for? I'd also recommend looking at recent issues. What have they published recently? Have they been publishing in the area that you are working on? That could be good or bad. You know, if they published a whole bunch of papers, maybe they're more interested in something else. But if there's some key paper that just came out and yours is following up on that or adding to that, that's something that could be a huge advantage, and you can talk about that in your cover letter. And so that could be really important as well. So looking at recent issues is good. What I always recommend is actually looking at the editorial board and going through and seeing who is there. Do you know anyone? Because that's one thing too, in your cover letter, and I've heard from different people, sometimes they say, oh, the cover letter is not important. I'll tell you, I actually pay a lot of attention to the cover letter because it tells me how novel this article might be. But in your cover letter is also where if you see an associate editor or some type of editor on the editorial board who would be appropriate for your paper, you can suggest that person as a possible handling editor. So that could be really important. The other thing obviously is where you are in your stage of your career, because this is where you might need to consider, of course, the cost. We all consider the cost, but also the time to publication. So, I mean, I could tell you when I was first a postdoc and trying to get my first job, you know, that time to publication is extremely important. You want to get as many papers out the door as you can, good quality papers, of course. Later on, you know, it might not be as important. However, that could change if you're going up for tenure, for example, then you need to think about that time to publication. So that's something to consider when you view all these different journals that might pertain to your paper. Some authors do consider, of course, impact factor, altmetrics, which is a different measure based on social media reach, which is really gaining ground and recognition. And so there's other types of factors that people might choose to consider when they're looking at where to put their paper in what journal. So we could possibly talk about that later if people have questions. For international authors, what I'd really recommend, and we're gonna have time a little bit later to talk about international authors as well, but here I would just really recommend, if you're an international author and you're concerned about any fees or anything like that, it might be really worthwhile, worth your time, to contact the journal and the editorial office and ask about fee waivers. In some cases with some publishers, there are fee waivers. In some cases, these are for specific countries. In other cases, there just might be a ability, in some cases, maybe not to waive the whole fee, but to change it to some other level that would be more attractive and more feasible for you. I would probably say this could be also true for graduate students as well. So it's always, I would always say, don't be shy about asking. And so my last point here is, if in doubt, contact your editorial office, especially if you're first getting started. This could be, you know, sort of intimidating, but it's really, really important to go out of your way and just ask. The editorial office is there to help you. So in case you don't know like who the people are, I always thought it would be interesting and helpful to show you that there are people, faces behind the names. And so here's for our area and our journals, we have Amy McPherson, Beth Parada, and Rich Hun, who are on this call as well. And so Amy and Beth are the managing editors for, Amy is with American Journal of Botany, Beth is with Applications in Plant Sciences, and Rich is our production editor. And so these are, if you send them an email, this is who you're actually talking with. Again, very nice people, and they, the whole goal of our journals are to attract the best articles possible. And so we will bend over backwards to help many of you. You know, if you feel like, hey, I have this really good idea, this really good article, I want to know if it fits with your journal, we'll tell you, because we don't want you to go through the whole review process only to find out, no, it's not a good fit. So in many cases, we will work with authors, you know, before they even submit if you have a question about that. So don't be shy. Please go ahead and contact our editorial office or whatever editorial office of any journal that you're considering. All right, next, the other thing that's really cool is that a lot of publishers now have author resources websites, and this is the one for Wiley. They have a really nice website where you could see the very first option here is find a journal. And so I put down below, and again, we're going to share all this information later, but down below is the web address for Wiley, and you could just look maybe for Google, you know, Wiley journal authors, something like that. But there's a lot of tips here about preparing your manuscript, you know, about the whole process of what happens when you go through the whole review process. And these are also, I should note, are going to be topics for our second webinar for next week that Pam Diggle will be giving. That's more of the editorial perspective. So you can get a lot more information there. But again, I just want to point out that there's these really great author resources, for example, through Wiley itself. Okay, now what I'd like to do is we're going to revert back to our panel here. And I had these questions, and I'm curious too. So I wanted to know for our panel, how do you start to write? And specifically, and this is one part of that, is how do you overcome writer's block? I call it the blinking white cursor on your screen when you don't know how to start. So if anyone of our panel wants to hop in and let us go. Roxia?
Yes, well, just taking from Marcelo, that he was talking about the outline, and that's usually very, very useful to have an outline to start writing. But anyway, like, I think that the best thing to do first is just to have very clear which is your question, which are the results that you are showing that answer that question. So having that in clear is kind of the first step, and start writing from there, like mostly results and also the methodology. And then the outline usually is very, very helpful for the introduction, and also to have the discussion in parallel sometimes, just to avoid them repeating several ideas at both parts. So that's something. Sometimes, well, to overcome this writer's block, it's just there are some days that you are more inspired to actually write one part of the paper or develop some specific part according to the last paper that you have been reading about that. And other days you can be more focused on a different section or describing more a particular result. So that's some ideas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, anyone else?
I'll just jump in there and just add. Yeah, I always outline my papers as well, so that, I mean, that's before we even get there to start putting anything on the screen, right? I always start with I always have a notepad and a pen, and then I'll flip through like the strata of notes about a paper from months ago often, and look back and see what I was trying to do originally. And that's actually quite useful. I think that sort of one of the things that helps me with writer's block and getting started is that it can often be, you use different parts of your brain, I feel like, when you're writing versus when you're typing. And that can often help get things moving. But that, first of all, starting with that really clear outline, a really clear question that you're going to answer and address. I mean, that's important just for the research itself. And, in our lab, we talk about sort of research projects as papers from the very beginning, because I think that it's important that while you're designing the project itself and designing those questions, that you are thinking about how, you tell that story to other people in the first place. And you don't want to end up missing something important that you should have done 2 years ago, because we've all done that. This is experience speaking, right? So you try to make sure that you sort of do that outlining along the way as well. And I think that if you've done that, it makes writing that paper up at the end a lot simpler. And the other thing I do to sort of overcome writer's block, before I said I sort of often, one of the tips I got was to just sort of, if it's not flowing, just kind of step away and do something different. And that's true, but also I often find if I just force myself to sit there for 10 minutes, it doesn't always go at first, but it usually after that point, it'll be, 2 hours disappear then. And I think that's important, just to get over that hump. It can take just that little bit of focus. But getting that outline down is important. And I often start writing a manuscript with my people too, with myself and people in my lab, with the figures. I don't know how everyone else seems to have sort of different approaches to this, but a lot of people I know start with the figures, and that's what you're writing a story around. And so having, I think, at least an outline of what the figures will be in a paper is really important. So if you're having a hard time putting words to paper itself, getting those figures put together can be really helpful. And then you spend a lot of time describing what's the results in those figures and the rest of the paper. And I think that's a really good place to start to get traction. So.
Yeah, I get figures and I tape them to the wall.
Yeah.
So I look at them for like a day or two, let it gel in my head. All right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it sometimes you don't see things either until you actually have the figures, and it's a process, right? I mean, I think people often think that some people just, crank them out. It's sort of, I've worked with a lot of people of various levels of academic achievement, and everybody goes through the same stuff. It doesn't matter if you're a Genius MacArthur Award winner or a fellow of the Royal Society or a starting student. Everybody sort of has those days where you just stare at a blank page and try to write. And 3 sentences can be progress sometimes, right? Yeah. But to get that, to do it though, it just takes consistency for me, just sitting down and trying. So, giving it that 10 minutes to see if it's going to happen. So
yeah, good points. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can jump in. Yeah, one thing that really helps me when I am in a very bad day, is try to dissect what I have in my to-do list. So for example, instead of I will write the introduction, I put with a box on the side, I will write one sentence or one paragraph. And typically, if you can overcome this one sentence, then it gets much easier. But it's real, and it's not happening only to one person. All of us have some bad days. So if I try to really dissect and make more achievable goals, that really helps me in a bad day. Some days are incredible, and of course, then you don't need any help. But
yeah, have any of you ever found that there's a certain time of day that's best, or circumstances that help with the writing?
Yes, usually during the evenings for me works best. But yes, I was checking on the comments that Stephanie suggested about the Pomodoro timer, like trying to be on task 25 minutes and 5 minutes of break. And that I found that is usually very helpful at the beginning. But then when you are very focused, like writing is kind of, if you have like the inspiration at that time, you cannot just take a break there, because it's kind of, okay, you are in the right moment to write, so just continue on that way. And something about the figures, like, yes, I found very helpful always to have a little notebook to have the diagrams about the figures and all that, and then starting from there. And also never put a number on the figures, never like enumerate them. That's something useful, because otherwise you're kind of like biased about the number, and it's better to not have just titles. So then you can just, okay, no, it's better this first and this in the other order. So you are more free to change the order of the figures or what parts are more important in your manuscript.
Yeah. Some of the things I do is, if I have writer's block, I'll, sometimes you have to force yourself, and other times you have to go away and go like for a run or something and come back. So, and you have to allow yourself that flexibility. I've also found sometimes I write really well if I'm exhausted, because I'm just like, I don't care. I'm just getting the point down, boom, 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 you know, and then you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh, that looks pretty good. But I don't know if I would recommend that so much. So. Great.
Yeah, I was gonna add, I always work in the mornings if I can on writing. I find it's when my mind is fresh, and I try to, I mean, in non-pandemic times, I usually just work in my home office actually for the first few hours of the day, and then before going to campus, so I don't have any distractions. I can just write. And I think one of the best pieces of advice I got about writing in that sense too is to just try to always be writing, like try to set aside, a few hours or a couple hours a day to do that. And I think, especially as you progress in academia, there are so many demands on your time that it can be hard to find that time. And so I've tried to really keep that protected. The pandemic has changed all that, but eventually we'll be back to normal and able to sort of to do that a little bit better. But always the first period of the day, or often, and after everyone else has gone to bed, I'll get back in the zone at like 10 o'clock at night or something. It'll go on for too long, probably, anyway.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I think everyone has their own tips. And I only know one person, I won't say who it is, but I know one person who could sit there and just write out perfectly, like without even thinking. And I think the rest of us, like, I always rewrite. And, a lot of people think as scientists, we just, we're experts and we can just type it all out and write it all out and it's fine. So be kind to yourself. Okay. Well, so this is great. So I was trying to come up with different tips, and this is what some of us were talking about in the editorial office too. But some of the tips, of course, is you need to hit on the right level of detail, right? So it can't be not enough. I mean, you don't want to have enough, you don't want to have not enough detail, but you also don't need to go overboard on the other side. And I think this was also mentioned earlier. We talked about being really concise. I do sometimes see, and this is usually beginning authors where, and I did this myself too, so I'm totally guilty, is we try too hard to be scientific and to throw in these big words. And it's like, no, just be as simple and concise and get to your point as you can. Another point, of course, is to avoid plagiarism. Most of us know about plagiarism, but from time to time with the journals, we see people who actually self-plagiarize. And a lot of, all of our articles that that arrive at the journal, we run through plagiarism services. Many other journals do this. It's called iAuthenticate or some other services. And many of us who teach at universities, we do the same things with our students. But oftentimes that will pick up the same text in a different paper, and we go and look, it's the same person's paper. And so we have seen cases where the same person just recycles the same text over and over. That's easier with things like primer notes, which of course with applications of plant sciences we don't do anymore. But we always definitely encourage people, and sometimes it's hard because you've already written that thought and you've published it and you're like coming back to it again. It's just like try to write it a little differently to make things a little bit more interesting. So try to avoid that self-plagiarism if you can. And I think this already came out in the conversation we had thus far is, you know, just think ahead, you know, especially as you're doing a study about how to best present your results, you know, as you go along. And so we'll see that in a little bit too. So great. Well, this is wonderful. So the other things about the writing strategies, and it didn't come up here in our discussion, but I just wanted to mention it briefly, is it's always good to be thinking about how to divide your work into publishable units. And so you might have a big study. If it's really big, you know, you might be thinking, oh, this could be worth, you know, 2 or 3 papers or more. You always need to be thinking about that. But you want to be careful that you don't have like a whole bunch of little tiny papers in smaller journals versus, you know, 1 or 2 really groundbreaking heavy duty papers in some larger, you know, higher level, more respectable journals. So that's something you sort of have to think about as you go along. And truthfully, that's also should be a conversation with the authors as you start to develop, you know, your study, is to try to talk about, okay, how are we going to parse this up if it needs to be. So that's something you do need to think about. So the other thing I've found, people get confused as authors as to what is appendix material and supplemental material. And so in applications of plant sciences, we have both, and we very frequently, Beth Parada and I very frequently have to go through and try to figure out, oh, should this be the appendix or the supplemental? And again, authors are confused. So this is what it is. So think of the appendix information as extra information. It could be figures, it could be protocols in the sense of our journal that you want to have included in the actual paper should someone download it as a PDF. It's important enough where you want it there. If it's other information that is not as important to the central focus of the study, but you still want readers to have access to it, then that would be supplemental. What that means, I always think of it as they have to maybe do a click on a website that will get them to that supplemental information that they can download. Another thing is just, frankly, in terms of ease of copy editing and the publication process, if you have like a big Excel file, for example, it's not going to be really workable as an appendix. That would be more appropriate as a supplemental material. So again, that's another question as you go through. You can always ask the editorial office. And, you know, oftentimes like we'll go back to authors and say, hey, we think this should be, you know, supplemental. Is that okay? Or does it really need to be in the appendix? So that can be a conversation. But that's what those 2 types of categories are. Another idea here I wanted just to, and I'm going to open this up to the panel because I think we have people who are more expert than I, but I'd like to talk about maybe tips and strategies for EAL, so English as additional language authors, where English might not be their native tongue. Suggestions that you would have for others, or if others in the chat want to comment or to ask questions. I just wanted to open that up as well for our group here.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is the reality of this is that it's impossible for someone like me or anyone else that is not native speaker of English. We will never be perfect. You will always be in doubt if it's in, on, or at, for example, the prepositions and things like this. But it gets easier, and you will have to have proofread by someone before it goes to publication. But it is worth the effort to try to write straight in English if it's possible, because the style is so different in Latin languages or Slavic languages from English. We tend to beat much more around the bush. We try not to go so straight to the point. For us, it's considered, our literature is all like about digression and going to one story and coming back. And we are trained like this, so we don't get lost when we are reading. But for someone from English, like, it says like, wow, this person is going completely astray, so this makes no sense. So it is helpful if you can try to write in English, and then with your co-authors you can perfect it. But yeah, it will never be the same, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's why I was saying, like, trying to just write what you want to say and not to be perfect in every paragraph, and then you will have the opportunity to review several times. But if you are trying always to have that paragraph perfect, being your second language, English, it's hard to overcome that writer's block. And also, well, yes, as Marcelo was saying, like, it's never going to be perfect. We always have doubts about which or that, or which are the prepositions correct. And sometimes it's useful not like write in English and then proofread for some from some colleague or someone who is in the area, actually, because there are a lot of, like, also, well, services or people who can proofread that, but they're not botanists or evolutionary biologists. So it's very hard to understand the point of the sense of different paragraphs, or just not being in in this area. So that's something that could be useful too.
And I think as reviewers, when we all get reviews to do every now and then, we can help. Like, especially if your native language is English, and if it's not terrible, of course, if it's not understandable, then of course you should send it back and say, please revise it. But if it's just one preposition, instead of just saying like, oh, this has to be reviewed by a native speaker, you can do the change. You know, this is really helpful when I see that happened with my papers, that someone was sympathetic and changed what was not clear, or pointed exactly how a possible solution I tried to give. For example, this is not so clear, why don't we divide into two sentences, for example? And because it's a cliche, like for us, we open and our names are our names, so it's obvious that we are not English or American or Australian. So it is open and say, oh, you have to revise the English. Yeah. If you can help, if it's not terrible, it's really helpful for those who are reviewers of these papers to help also. Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are great comments. Mike, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I am obviously English as a native speaker of English, but I have many students in my lab that have come through, and postdocs that have come through that have English as an additional language. And I think that as an advisor, and to folks that are colleagues of students or colleagues with folks who are have English as an additional language, for me, I think it's just the process, of going through these things and just making sure that things are laid out. I mean, I'm always sort of very patient with this and trying to follow the flow, and I find that the logic is often easier to follow. And I have some students that have been English as a native language, and I'm like, I'm not sure what you're trying to say here, versus students where it's their second or third language. And I just think it just takes patience, and just bring people along, and don't expect it to be perfect. And that I feel like the thing though that to improve not only is to sort of just take those iterative steps, but working with someone who's patient and will work with you to improve that, and to being open to improvement, so that you get to that level of being able to write a paper or a grant proposal when you're have your own lab or out on your own, without needing it to go back through that sort of review all the time. With that said, as a reviewer too, I think that it's easy enough to just be patient with folks. And I don't know, I feel like English is this this language that we all use globally at this point in all of our scientific publications and presentations, for the most part. I don't expect it to be perfect. I couldn't write very well in Spanish, for example. It would be it'd just be very difficult to make that translation and that jump. And I think that for the native English speakers out there, just to be sympathetic and patient, and not expect perfection. At the end of the day, I think the scientific ideas come through just fine usually. And also I'll say that I don't always know what the correct preposition to use is either, and end sentences wrong, and I'll get these kinds of comments from reviewers too, and it'll be sometimes funny. I think that sometimes reviewers will think that someone else wrote that sentence that's on the paper. I think, no, that was me. It was not my student that doesn't speak English. You know, there's a non-native English speaker. So nobody's perfect either. And the beauty of English is it's a pretty much of a free-for-all as a language. So as long as we can understand what we're saying, it's all good. Someday we'll use emojis, I guess. I don't know. But at this point, I think that just being patient with people and working with folks, and I think people are more patient now. Maybe that's not true than in the past with this. But hopefully, we can make that a lot easier for our colleagues that are non-native English speakers. So.
And I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat too, so that's great. What I was going to say, you guys already said it, is if you're unsure and you're an international, EAL author, go ahead and contact the editorial office. And, if you need suggestions for people who could read it, if you need English language editors, that's definitely something that we will be more than happy, to help you with. I will tell you too, like a lot of the papers that I get, if we read through them initially, we want to see if it's appropriate for the journal, first of all, before we, take it in for review. Oftentimes in that, we might see that the English maybe is not as well as it could be. And even before it goes into the system, we sometimes would send it back to the authors and ask, hey, can you, I think Roxio said this, can you just have maybe someone else read it over for you? Even then, sometimes we've had papers come in and you could tell the content is there, there's something there, it's great, but the English needs a little help. My perspective is, hey, if the content's there, the English, the grammar and all that, we can work on that. And sort of like what Mike was saying, I've made a lot of funny, strange things with grammar myself. And so I like the idea that you guys sort of brought forward of we all need to help each other. And I think especially as reviewers, for those of you out there who are English native speakers, it is really important, to be mindful of where someone is coming from, being if they're English as an additional language, if they're a graduate student and this is their first time ever writing, that type of thing. We need to make those considerations. And then in some cases, I found myself putting more input and more advice and suggestions because you want to help that person, learn from that experience and get even better in their writing. So yes, so I think that's all definitely, that's definitely great. So thank you for that. All right, next we're going to move on to presenting your results. And this is one, it's a topic that's of interest to me because I like odd things. And this goes into data manipulation. And so we're going to be talking about how to best present your results. But before we do that, I want to talk about like what not to do. And so a lot of people have questions, and this started years ago. This is an example of a paper. This is from 1995, radiology. And this paper came out with the idea of, well, what is acceptable or not in terms of manipulating images. And here we're talking about, what people say photoshopping, right? So on this image here, they have a radiograph on the left, and you can see there's some dust particles and things like that. And then they've cleaned it up a little bit, touched it up. And so the question is that okay or not? And then of course there's, gets a little different. So you can have the next option of, in this case, this is what they're calling a fraudulent use of digital touch-ups. And so this is a kidney where you could see an A on the bottom part, there's essentially a cancerous lobe. You can see that dark. And then they've, in the B version is where they've actually touched it up, and you see they've actually moved the dark lobe upwards. And so that's too much, right? So that's manipulating your image. Hopefully no one does this and you don't have that tendency to do it, but I will tell you that from time to time we do get these situations. And many journals, if not all, and this is where I would yield to Amy and Beth, is that many journals have software now to detect any image manipulation. And so that's one thing that you need to think about. Here on the left is an example where where I see it, or I have seen it in the past, is with DNA gels. And so you have bands, and in both cases on the left, for those two images on the left, that's the original image. The one on the right is the manipulated, and you can see essentially that some bands have been erased. And so you could do this, of course, in Photoshop. So this is a no-no, don't do it, right? And because of this, both the American Journal of Botany and Applications in Plant Sciences came out with an image manipulation policy. So we have that in the instructions for authors. So again, don't do it if just don't do it. But then some people ask, well, what if, I have a dirty image and I just want to touch it up? Is something okay, or is it all bad? And so what I've done in the past is sort of came up with this. We have a class for graduate students, so we've talked about this. And if you look at a lot of different resources, different journals, they sort of come to the conclusion that there are varying levels of acceptability. But this is, I should mention, something you should always ask the journal about, and you could put in your cover letter. So what typically is acceptable is adjusting the brightness or contrast of an image or something to your image, but you have to do it for everything in the image, right? You can't just do one thing or another. Cropping the image to show something is appropriate. What may be acceptable, and this again is where you definitely would have to put in your cover letter to the journal that, hey, I have this image and I changed it in this way, is this acceptable? Is if you switch, 2 lanes on a DNA gel, right? And when you ran it, there are a few other samples in between, and you want to make it nicer so they're right next to each other. You could ask to do this. What I would say is you would actually have to, what I've actually requested myself is to have the original image and the manipulated image so you can compare those. And then usually that needs to be stated in the image legend, the description of that figure, or in the methods. But again, you would need to ask that and to mention it in your letter to the editor. Now, obviously, what's not acceptable is if you're deleting or adding things to your image, if you're moving features around, if you're taking, part of one image and moving it and putting it into another image, and you might laugh, but this has been done. Not that I'm aware of for us, but it has come out in other types of journals and led to retractions. So that's something that, again, it might make sense to you not to do some of the more obvious, not acceptable things. But again, if you have any questions, just ask, because journals do have the software where they can indicate whether there's been changes, to a JPEG or a TIFF or to any of those images. All right, next we're going to move on to presenting your results. Before we do that, I just want to make a big plug, however brief, about open science and what I feel is a really urgent need for us to be open about our data and to share our information as widely as possible. This is a slight change from the past when scientists generally, wanted to I want to say hoard or to, keep their data close at hand and then parcel it out and publish in different pieces. And for some of that, you might want to. But the idea is that when we have different scientists who are willing to share their data, they might publish one paper and someone else publishes another paper, but they put that data in these public repositories, then someone else could come along and do a meta-analysis of all that actual data, and you can get a lot more information that any single individual could do. So we really suggest doing that. Both Applications in Plant Sciences and American Journal of Botany now have these badges, not the pre-registered ones, the open data and the open material. You might be familiar with this. The Center for Open Science actually put forward these things. The idea is that if an author goes ahead and puts their information available in a public repository, and there's a number of different repositories, you guys might be familiar, GitHub, Dryad, Figshare, all these types of things, then you could have this special badge, placed on your article. So this goes not only for the data, It could be the figures and tables. It could be the raw data, even the code that you use to create, you know, and analyze your data. That's all very important. So I just want to make a plug for that. A lot of journals are looking for that now, and especially we are as well. And I just personally think that it's really important as a way to propel our field forward. So that's something to think about. All right, so here we're going to toss it back to the panel. And this is sort of an open-ended question, but what do you do, or what do you pay attention to try to make really effective tables and figures? We talked a little bit before about maybe getting all of your tables and figures together, and I have it on my wall, right, to try to figure out how to tell your story. But when you get ready to do the publication of those, are there any concerns or things that you're looking for to make those like really, really great tables and figures?
Well, I think that one of the most important things about figures is to be self-explanatory. Like, for example, that you can understand the figure even without reading the footnote, the legend. So that's quite important. So, for example, if you have some sort of color indicating, I don't know, a particular thing, just not saying in the legend, okay, this color means that, but including in a little box or something inside the figure as well. So that's usually very helpful. And also about tables, it's that they shouldn't be redundant with the manuscript, like the text. So that's important that all the information is just included once. And in the tables, it's very useful also to have some sort of, I don't know, like bolded for the values that you want to pay attention, like the significant ones or something. So you have to use as many tools as you can to have something simple, concise, but that you make the reader to pay attention to the important things that you are showing there.
Yeah, one thing that I also find, this idea of having parts in bold in the table are really fundamental. And also I think if you can come up with summarizing figures that really show the information, for example, with illustrations. I've seen articles that are really nice talking about like different features in plants or animals, and they have like the phylogeny and the pictures, and it summarizes so well sometimes an idea. So try to come up with this type of figures that summarize the idea are really helpful, I think.
Can I jump on that? I'm just curious, do you guys do your own figures, or do you have to, are there cases where you have to rely on others? You know, if it's a phylogeny or something, do you have to search around?
Yeah, I do my own figures usually. Yeah, always I have done that. Yes, and usually something that I find interesting that some articles, they are, I don't know, doing some evolutionary study or something about a particular group of plants, animals, whatever, but they don't include any figure or any illustration about the organism that they're studying. So usually if you have almost like a phylogeny or something, but you have to show something about the organisms behind that, that's very helpful to have an idea about your study system as well.
I also do my own figures, but for example, many institutions do have also a person hired to do that. UNAM, I know that my institute has one person. I haven't tried yet, but I certainly, if there's something that I find too difficult to execute and the person can help, and for sure there's some people also that you can hire, I imagine.
Yeah, Mike, you were going to say something?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I do most of my figures, or people in my lab are making them. So it's sort of, and sort of from that perspective, say a couple of things. One thing that we try to do to make sort of figures effective is try to use as much as possible sort of colorblind friendly palettes, so that people can see the colors. There's a bunch of websites you can find different palettes for the hex codes, for example, to make those accessible. And the other thing I find, as someone who gets a lot of figures from students, is that you can, it's possible to figure out how big you want that thing to be at the very beginning. So I think students often will just give me these figures that look good on the screen with weird font sizes then, and when you actually scale this to fit it on like the page in the dimensions it's going to be, you know, you can't read anything because they weren't thinking about that. So I think from the very beginning, I would use, we're all like all Linux lab, so we're using like all Inkscape and GIMP and things like this for doing Photoshop type work. But you know, you can you can scale it right there. I mean, and then you can actually see what 12-point font or 10-point font will look like. So I would recommend that right from the very beginning. That's a big help because it just saves time for everyone throughout the process, advisors included, who might find themselves asking for those original files and spending 2 hours rescaling a figure, which I've spent too much time doing probably in my life. But yeah, I think making it accessible, and I always try to make effective figures. I think it's, I think that's challenging. You know, I think it can be challenging. I'm a very numbers oriented person. I want to see the numbers. And so, and everybody thinks differently. So it can be hard for me to come up with some of these very artistic, beautiful figures that people make that I always find very effective, but we all work with what we have. How's that? So, but I at least trying to make the font sizes and the colors so that they're very accessible for people, I think is also a basic aim that we should all shoot for.
Great. And Roxy, I think I saw you just put that in the chat, the color blindness link, and that's a good one.
It's a link that you can check your images. It's yes, there it can be visible for people with problems with color blindness. And something else I want to mention is that probably when you are doing the final version of your figures, you want to be sure which journal you want to publish, actually, to submit that manuscript, because depending on that is the size of your figures or some specification about the graphics in general.
Yeah, I have to say, I always have an agonizing time when I'm publishing my own paper. You finally get, you know, it's going to be published, you're so happy. And then they said, and we need your final figures. And you're just like, you know, now I'm going to have to get in the right format and, you know, those types of things. So yeah, editors go through that too with our own papers. So no, this is great. So I had some tips, and then I have a few more questions for you guys because you brought up some more things in my head. This is sort of what Mike was saying, you know, make the figure, you know, reasonable, you know, make it, especially if it's a graph, a table, or a graph, let's go with that way, you know, provide units, that's a big thing. With graphs, label the axes, make sure the font is large enough, because I do the same thing. When you have to shrink it down to the size it needs to be for the journal, then the fonts are all funky and you have to make them larger and go back and forth and yell at it for a while. We already talked about the colors for those who have color blindness. And this is important. I want to emphasize this because when I was a graduate student, I did this huge, beautiful presentation and I was so happy. And afterwards, one of my committee members told me, he's like, you know what? I couldn't understand a thing that you had on there. And I realized I had highlighted everything in red that was important. And on my graph, I had all these red lines and stuff. And so I learned the bad way. So that's important. The other thing is what I've found helpful is make sure that even if you have a color figure, and nowadays, you know, you could publish this online, you know, for free. You don't have to pay a color charge in many cases. But if you're going to be in print, you might have to pay a huge, huge price there. But even if you're just doing it in PDF with color, make sure that you print it out in black and white, because other people might be downloading your PDF file and printing it out in black and white, and you need to make sure that you could still see the differences in the colors, and that comes out on, you know, a black and white image. Obviously, error bars, make sure that they're on there and they state what they are, if they're standard error or a standard deviation, those sorts of things. And then the tables, of course, look at the journal and what they recommend, but you might need to have subscripts or superscripts, and some of those might be footnotes, and so you just need to follow all of that. I wanted to follow back with one question. I forget which of you guys said this, but it's something that I don't know the answer, and I've been trying to figure out how to do this. But in some cases, I want to show some mean values, right? And so you can graph that in a graph, you know, a bar chart, a histogram, and just have, you know, those means, or you could put it in a table, but you shouldn't do both. Is one better than the other? This is what I've personally struggled with. Maybe everyone else is thinking the same way. So
I mean, for me, I'll just say that if it's like a huge amount of data, like, you know, I'm currently making box plots for something that has 40,000 data points in each of the boxes, right? I find that easier than adding, you know, seeing the distribution of those things compared in that way is a little bit easier than the summary statistics in a table. And I find that to be effective. I feel like tables are useful when the summary statistics kind of really capture the distributions very well, or they're sort of normally distributed. Maybe that's one way to think about it, or they're a smaller number of point estimates, you know, versus something where you've got a huge amount of data and you really want to be able to compare those distributions and the shapes. I think it kind of actually probably matters more about whether you really care more about the mean or the median value versus the overall distribution. And so much of what I do in genomics, and sort of looking at those sorts of questions with genomic approaches, the means can be like significantly different, even though they're not really that different because you got so many data points. So actually seeing those distributions can be really important to understand qualitatively how different something is. So I feel like that's probably, you know, how I decide if it's going to end up in a table as a set of summary statistics, like a mean with a standard error or something, or standard deviation, versus described in some other fashion. So, yeah.
What do you guys use to make your figures? Because I usually use R with ggplot and things like that. I don't know if there's other packages or things that you prefer, if you have to get fancy.
I usually use InDesign to make my pictures. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, for me it depends, because when you have like, well, you extract your, like in phylogenetics, you extract your tree, and sometimes like, yes, or if you have some, I know, like a photograph that you need to improve a little bit, like it could be Photoshop, but when it's something that is vector that you are adding, it could be CorelDRAW or Inkscape, that kind of things. But for plots, like you were mentioning, yes, R, or just extracting from there and then changing colors, or that it could be also in CorelDRAW, for example. Yeah.
I was laughing at, I think, Mike, you had said, you know, when you might have to go back, you know, years later. So I had something where I had a student, like, years later, we finally got this paper out, and it turned out that it was in SigmaPlot, and I didn't have a license anymore, and that's all that she had. So I had to buy like the new license to SigmaPlot so I can convert it to, you know, SAS or do something. You know, it was just like this. It took a week or two to get like 2 figures, you know, just so I could send it to the journal.
This is why it's important. I was going to comment this on the previous set of slides. Why it's important that we have open science, because in my own lab, it's important that not just for me, but that my students post all of their original data to a repository, so it doesn't get lost in the detritus of our own computers. So you can go back and make those sorts of plots very, very easily. I use R. We use, like, you know, it depends on what it is, but for a lot of that sort of stuff, and often actually do like coloring and things then in like Inkscape or something else to do that. I see someone asked, what's the effective way to add scale bars without losing quality? I save everything as a scalable vector of some sort, so like an SVG or PNG, and then it scales with the same quality when you put it out. That's how when you output it, when you save that as a different format than later on. So that's how I solve that problem. So
I use Illustrator a lot, which is really hard to use, and maybe there's a better way now, but that's what I'm schooled into doing. But no, that's a good point, especially for those of you, if you're just starting out, save all your data. If you think it's will be valuable or not, just save it, you know, put it into a directory, because you never know, one day you might need to pull that back out. Yeah, that's a really important point. Okay, let's move right along. So just a little bit more about data visualization. And this is why I asked that one question about tables versus graphs. This is my first paper ever that I published. This actually happened to be in American Journal of Botany in '99, so you can do the math. But I was so proud of this paper. It was an inbreeding depression study, and we had all these different maternal lines, and we measured all these different things, germination, you know, seed production, survival, and all this. And this was also total biomass. And this just, I had this huge figure, and I just took one little panel from the figure and blew it up for you. But this is total biomass after we took the whole plant and we dried it. And in gray is the self progeny, and black is the outcross progeny. So we're trying to compare them. And so I had published this, so happy about it. But I remember when I was doing this, I was trying to figure out each of these bars is a mean value for that family, for that trait. And I was trying to figure out, you know, would it be better to put that in a table or somewhere where someone has access to those actual means? And I was an undergrad at the time, so I just said, oh, you know, I'll just do this, and I did. But then a few years later, then I got contacted, and someone said, hey, we're doing a meta-analysis, and we have a problem. So one of the problems was a minor one. I didn't really have a separate little legend, like gray bar, black bar equals this, which I actually like to do. I had it in the text, which was helpful, but that should have been there. Years later, by the way, I had an article, and I had forgotten to put the description of the colors in the text. It was just in the little bar graph, and that mistakenly got erased from the actual publication when it went through the galley proofs. And so I was so happy it was published, and all these people came back and they're like, we have no idea what you're trying to say because there's no colors. But that was that study. Going back to this, what I had found out, I had people come back and they said, hey, we want to actually grab your data for a meta-analysis, but we can't see any values here. They were actually looking at the bars and trying to figure out exactly, you know, what value might that be. So they went ahead and asked me to send it, and I did. And so this is a separate paper that came out in 2011, so years later, where they took analysis of a whole bunch of different studies. So ours was just one of them. But they actually, I had to dig back. This goes back to our question about save everything. So I had to dig back to the data that I had as an undergrad, which fortunately I save because I have everything. And I had to extract that all and send it to them for their data analysis. So I learned my lesson. Nowadays, what I try to do, and I don't know if this is the right answer, but with my own work, I try to actually put the mean values. If I'm gonna have a figure, I'll put the mean values as supplemental. So if anyone ever wants it, they can, and or I'll put that in a whole online repository. So it's just like, boom, data dump. If anyone wants to use this in the future, here you go. So that was something that was sort of interesting. I just wanted to, trying to leave some time for questions. And so I just wanted to leave you with a few suggestions for data visualization resources. And one is this. This is just a short article in Advanced Materials, but it gives a whole bunch of really cool tips. And some of these make perfect sense, but we might not think about it when we're actually making a figure. And so, you know, on the left there is, you need to have, you know, high contrast if you want to see something. So obviously if you have a black background, you should have white text and so forth. And then on the right side, it's sort of showing you different ways. If you're trying to make a point and you want something to pop out of an array of different, whatever you're measuring, you know, it's showing you how you could do that. So again, I'm a visual person, but it helps to see examples. And so that's what this resource has. So this is one. And again, we could post all these, but that's one that you could just type that in and you could pull it up on the internet. This is one of my favorite books, and it's an older one. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this. This is the Visual Display of Quantitative Information. There is a second version that I think came out in 2014, but it actually has these really great examples of a way to combine a bunch of really different information into one graph. And so the top is not that. The top is actually one of my favorite. It's a histogram. And this is a pretty famous one. But it's a group of students in a class, and they're standing according to height in different bins. And so you could sort of see the living histogram of what that is. And you can sort of see there's a lot of short women on one side and tall men on the other side, which was typical for that time period, I guess. And then the bottom is just an example of one type of graph where they're actually combining solar radiation with New York and London stock market prices. So I guess trying to see if it's sunnier outside, you know, does the stock prices go up, right? So anyway, so these are just some examples. And then Pam Diggle and I were talking about this, and she suggested, someone had mentioned this to her, this Fundamentals of Data Visualization book. So I just ordered this, it should arrive later on today. But this one looks really cool too. So this, again, shows you different ways of presenting your data, and in this case, largely with color. And so these are just really great resources to think beyond just the typical histograms or the scatter plots, which might be good, right? It might be appropriate, but there might be other means that you can think about nowadays. So just some ideas there. So essentially, I want to tie it up just a little bit so we can get to, if people have particular questions for our panel. And we've been trying to keep an eye on the chat. We've been answering some of those as we go along. But essentially, what it comes down to for writing well is we talked a lot about, you know, you need to know what you're writing. You need to really think about your audience, who you're writing for. Maybe we didn't talk about that so much. But really, what is the main point you want to communicate, right? What do you want to get across? What is the new novel? What's new and novel about your study? You know, how do the results of what you're talking about, how does that contribute to what we already know? How does it push the field forward? You know, in other words, why should it be published? But what will that do for others in your discipline? And then we talked a little bit about, you know, the best ways to actually visualize and present your data. And again, that's supporting your argument, the main point that you want to make. And that's really important. And what I always try to think about is what are the main points to leave your reader, right? After they go through your paper and they put it down, in my mind, almost like the last paragraph is like your last chance to make that point of what you want them to get out of it, right? It could be the main point of the paper. It could be where can you go from here? That is really, really important. So essentially, I always tell students, you want to like wrap it all up, you know, with a bow. You want to have a nice concrete story that has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And so that becomes really, really important. So that's just my perspective of how to tell your story in a really effective one. But that's something that I think can be helpful. So brief reminder before we go on to questions and I open it up. I had mentioned that this was the first of 2 webinars. And so our second one, Pam Diggle, who's the editor-in-chief, of course, of American Journal of Botany, will be leading that. And that's more from the editorial perspective. So we talked a lot about what do you do to actually write the paper? And then she started taking it off with what's the next steps, you know, after, you know, you get that. How do you get your paper published once you have that made? So that will be on Tuesday, October 13th from 2. If you do want to sign up and you haven't yet, go ahead and register at the BSA Botanical Society of America website at www.botany.org. So, and that's also on their website. So if you just go to the main BSA website, scroll down a little bit, and then there's, you'll see this image there, and you can click and you can directly register. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to open it up. If anyone has any questions, and feel free, if you like, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can enter it in the chat. Tracy, I see, has asked, are you going to post the presentation? Yes, we will. I've checked a few times. It is indeed recording. So we will figure that out, how to do that. And Amy has already beat us here and said that the presentation will be posted on the BSA website. And again, that website is the information I gave earlier.
I just want to say thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome, Carmen. And I see your question about the color. I don't know if anyone has answered that for you.
Yeah, Amy or Beth, I think,
Okay.
answered partially.
Great.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly, Pam.
I have a question for the English as additional language people here. So I was thinking as I was listening to the discussion about some journals have a double-blind review process where your identity is not known to the reviewers. And so Marcelo, I think you said that, you know, your identity is known by your name, but that's not always true. And so I'm wondering if you feel disadvantaged by that process. I mean, or if that makes a difference, right? Are reviewers less likely to be patient or, you know, sort of positive about providing feedback on grammar if they understand that English is your additional language, or does it matter? Or I don't know, I was just wondering if that is an issue for a double-blind review process.
Yeah, I personally prefer, I don't like the double-blind type of revision. I don't know why, I just feel it's more, I even have been questioning nowadays if we should have blind review like anyways, maybe because I see so many angry reviewers nowadays that they say so many things that they wouldn't say if their names were there, you know, that sometimes I have to go back to the reviewer and say, can we tone down a little bit this maybe? Because I know it's tiresome and that sometimes I spend an entire day to review one paper, of course, if you want to do a good job. But yeah, try to be kind with the person because we feel so exposed when we have our article out there. But let me say that I feel that these people that when they get aggressive regarding like even the problems in English and grammar, usually you perceive that it's the person that is not really focusing on the scientific thing. So I think the good reviewers, they are more prone to help. And so this is something that I think the editors will have a good job there to notice this also and know how to do this interface between the reviewer and the authors. Yeah, but to be short, I think I don't like the double-blind process. I think the most open we can be, the better.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had a recent thing once where I had an international author who had a review that they thought was harsh, and it was because they were English as a second language. And it was interesting because I went back and I looked, and the reviewer actually was in the same case too. So we were just able to clear that up. But I think I was going to ask you too, if as an editor in your editorial role, do you then, if you see an overly harsh review, do you go back to that reviewer? Or do you try to moderate that yourself in your comments back to the author?
Usually I consult with the reviewer. I say, and do you think we could rephrase this part and say like this? How do you feel about that? Because especially there's a cultural difference. So some cultures are more aggressive naturally. It's not aggressivity, it's how we perceive it. But for them, it's the way to say. And then I say, can we have like a middle term and say this in a more, because the written words they are read differently, right? So yeah. But I try never to modify anything that the reviewer said or the authors without consulting them.
Okay, that's a good point. So I see Tracy has a question here. How do you feel about preprints? And I'll toss that back to Pam too. I mean, we do take preprints. Pam, do you want to say anything about with AJB policy on preprints?
I'm probably going to pass it on to Amy. So we're happy to take papers that have been posted on a preprint server. And we actually check preprint servers to see if there's anything appropriate for the journal and solicit submissions based on preprints. But then we have certain requests that we make once the paper has been accepted by the journal, then what you do with how you treat that preprint. And so Amy, I'm going to let you explain that.
Right. So yes, we're fine to work with papers that have been on a preprint server. we consider the journal or the article that's actually published in the journal to be the version of record. And Wiley has certain parameters around what can be done with the version of record. Yeah, it's an interesting, I'm quite curious to hear too what Marcelo has to say from his perspective at the IAWA journal. And Beth, you have something else to say.
I just wanted to add that it does state in our author guidelines that it has to be a non-commercial preprint server. So for example, bioRxiv is acceptable, and I'm going to forget now which PureJ, wait.
PureJ, right?
Yeah, yeah. There are some preprint venues that are actually commercial venues, and we technically cannot accept submissions for preprints that were published on those preprint servers. So it's always good to check if you know you want to submit to a particular journal, but you want to post your preprint. It's good to check before you post the preprint with the journal that you want to submit to make sure that that's okay.
But most journals these days are quite happy to get your paper even if you posted it on a preprint server.
I was just going to insert. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
Marcelo.
No, go ahead.
Marcelo was asked first, though. Actually, I'll
Okay.
let him comment on it from an editor perspective.
Yeah, but I don't have anything extraordinary to say. Just that we also are happy to take preprints, and we had very good experiences. For example, recently Alexandru Tomescu published a preprint, and it was so nice. We had forums and we had like live discussions, and I think it was good for everyone.
Yeah.
I also to feel that your inputs might be incorporated in the. So I found it extremely scientific and extremely beneficial for everyone. So yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I was going to say, as an author, I really I preprint everything, and have done so for like the last 4 or 5 years now. It is awesome because personally, I have not everything gets feedback, but like, you know, you think, oh, you send it around, you know, you send a paper to people to get some comments on before you submit it. You often do, you try to, and that doesn't always happen or get connected to the right person, but I'll get feedback from people. You know, I get emails and people say, well, we read this at our lab meeting, we didn't like this part, or whatever, you know, but it's great. You get some feedback, and I'm like, oh, this is cool. Yeah, I agree that that paragraph sucks. You know, let's change that. Or you know, I don't, you know, or well, that's not what we were trying to say. So yeah, now we know that in revision, when we revise this at the journal, we'll maybe make some modifications to that paragraph that the other reviewers might not have seen, right? It might not have caught, or before we submit it, sometimes we'll find that. But I do feel like that in the context of publishing, there is a lot of, in the 20 years or so that I've been doing, you know, submitting papers to journals, it's hard for me to tell if it's because, you know, the transition from student to postdoc to faculty member, if people just decided that, you know, they were going to get more aggressive and nasty, or it does feel like there's been a little bit of a shift. It's hard to tell. I mean, certainly that's commented on a lot. And so I think having the preprint and just getting the story out there too is often an accomplishment in and of itself. And then being able to build on that, you know, so many papers today too have that environment where you need to cite something, but like we've had papers in review for couple of years, 2 or 3 years, like, and go back through 6 versions of review, and you're like, oh my, okay, please, just, are we going to get this done? But the preprint's there, so you know, some of these we couldn't preprint, but you know, but you can cite that, and I think that's really important, especially as an early career researcher, because you have that product. So instead of having this list of things that are submitted in your CV and people roll their eyes at them or whatever and say, well, you know, on a committee, they might say, well, is that really submitted? Or does this person really have this many papers in prep or whatever? Preprint them. That would be, I would not hesitate today. And I think that journals are in an interesting place to think about how to accommodate those. I actually think that the ecosystem that we have, like within the AJB, the Botanical Society's family of journals is very good. We've got, I think hopefully it's a sustainable approach where we can have preprints that exist and then the papers of record that have taken into account all the revisions and changes that happen published at the journal. because I think it's a very good trade-off in getting people's work out there, getting early career researchers in particular, getting that work out and not being sort of held up by what might be a very long review process. And I think there's a lot of focus on being speedy with publications, and I think that's important for people's careers, but also at this point, getting things on the preprint server takes no time once you've submitted it, and we can all see your productivity. So I think it's a very important thing, I think, for people to do and to become accepting. I have colleagues here in our department that even 2 years ago would say, oh, there's just a lot of crap on those preprint servers. It hasn't been reviewed. And then I was having a conversation with one of them the other day, and this person said, you know what, I think I'm just gonna stick everything in my archive now. I'm so tired of dealing with these revisions. So I think that, you know, that sea change, that the way that you read and interpret papers, I mean, we all know this, that, you know, but I think there has been sort of maybe a little bit of a paradigm shift that you take and read the story for what it is. And if all the data are there and the figures are there, that's it. And, you know, you still have to be, in my opinion, as you know, a paper that's been published and is the paper of record has gone through that and has been reviewed, and people have tried to find and point out any problems and discrepancies. But you still have to, I think, approach them in a very similar way I approach preprints. It's that simple. You still have, I think, a lot of the same. I approach every paper like I'm reviewing it anyway. I guess I don't believe anything I see published until I've read it and convinced that it's good science, right? So anyway, so that's my thought on preprints. So I'll let Pam. I see Pam wanted to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to. Do I have time to ask one more question?
If it's really quick, we're out of time. But if it's quick,
so my question is for the panelists. And once you have a paper that's written, it has all the sections and all the figures, how many more drafts do you think you go through? Before you submit it, before you think it's ready to go?
I don't think they want to reveal it.
Yeah, any takers?
I think that it depends on the paper and who is writing that paper, because sometimes if it's a student, it will take longer sometimes, or yes, it depends. And in the expertise that we have, that particular area, if I'm doing something totally new, it will require more drafts before it's ready. And it depends on which is the process. Like every time that I do something, like add something to the manuscript, I name it as a different manuscript. So I have like, I don't know, 15 versions of like drafts before I submit it sometimes. And also depends on how many authors, because if there are several more authors, it will be more versions of that draft. So.
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat that's 5 to 10.
But I think that's really useful for beginning authors to hear that it's, you know, even when the whole, you know, you think the work is over, right? You have all the pieces put together. It's not over, not by a long shot.
Then you have the revision, and then you go through it again.
It also depends.
Thank you,
it
everyone.
also depends if you have a deadline.
Oh, Carmen, you said you have a deadline. Yeah.
And also
That's one thing we didn't say is the deadline. Yeah, Marcelo?
There's a moment you have to say, that's it. Because, and I think that's the job of the first author. The first author needs to draw the line and say, okay, this is, we'll go until here, and then because it can be interminable.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's gotten harder for me too, because we're all on Google Docs now for like about the last decade. So there aren't like that trail of papers where you see version 22 or whatever, like in the old day, like before, when I had everything on Word or on, you know, WordPerfect or whatever, locally saved. But I'd say easily, you know, that, yeah, 5 to 10 maybe. It really depends on the paper, but definitely multiple versions. But you have to move on with your life at some point too and call it a day, because nothing's ever perfect. So.
All right. Well, on that note, we need to call it a day. So I'd like to thank our panelists. So Mike, Roxia, Marcelo, thank you so much. And it looks like we successfully recorded this. So we will post this as soon as we can. So thank you, everyone. If you have any more questions, feel free to email myself or anyone associated with our journals. And good luck writing. So thank you, everyone.